But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." For this year, we focused a lot of our class and sermon time on instructions from the Bible about dealing with one another. For example, to serve one another, to encourage one another, to comfort one another, and so forth. There's nothing magical about these particular verses, but they do provide plenty of direction on how we should treat each other, and that's why we're studying them. You can put together other groups of similar verses, and I want to start this morning by looking at one of those other sets. They are verses that say, if this, then that. Let me read a few verses to show you what I mean here. These first two show, make sure they show what I want it to, yep. These first two show that love and obedience are related. That in 1 John 2:5, obedience leads to love. Whoever keeps his word, whoever obeys, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. Similarly, love leads to obedience. In John 14:15, we read, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Moving on, we see similarly that knowing God and obeying him are related. In 1 John 2, verse 3, "By this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments." If we obey, then we have come to know him. And in the other direction, knowing leads to obedience. In 1 John 3, verse 6, "No one who sins has seen him or knows him." And then finally, we see that knowing God and loving him go hand in hand. 1 John 4, verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." Here's what we've just put together if you want to make a quick sketch of it. I'm told I sometimes go too fast. So I'll give there just a moment. So what does this chart suggest? What is the conclusion that I'm drawing from it? It says that if I want to be right with God, I must love him, I must obey him, and I must know him. Now, two of these are sort of easy to understand. I must love God and I must obey him. There are lots of passages in the Bible, including some that we were just looking at, that tell me to love God. There are lots of ways that I can love him. For instance, I must respect him as a father, and I must recognize the love that he had for me even before I came to be, that he designed a way for me to go to heaven. How about obeying him? James tells us in chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, "If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." But what are these works that I must obediently complete? We read in John 6, verse 29, Jesus answered and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." Belief, Christ says, is the most important work. So obedience is required, but it starts with what I'll call active belief. Belief that motivates me to stand up and make something happen. What about the third one? I must know God. How do you normally get to know someone? You spend time together, perhaps doing a job together, perhaps grabbing a meal together. Perhaps at a Bible class or a Bible study at home, perhaps playing games or watching a game or sharing some other hobby. Most of those aren't directly available with God, but I can spend time together with Him, reading the Bible that He gave us, singing to Him, or spending time in prayer, talking with Him. I've got to do something of this sort. Knowing God is just as necessary as loving and obeying Him. What if I cut one out? What happens then? Let's run down this short list that we put together, starting with love. What happens if I don't put any effort into figuring out how to actively love God? Paul gives us one answer in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 2 and 3. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, that is, if I know God, and if I have all faith and so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. If I'm obeying God out of a sense of guilt, or to please my family, or because I want to get as many star stickers as I can on my page in the book of life, then it's all wasted effort. Acting without love profits me nothing. It doesn't do a bit of good for me. Living life without obeying God? I think we all know the answer to this one. If I know good and well what I need to do, I've made the effort to know God, and I'm too busy now to take time to keep obeying Him. If I love Him, but I'm too busy, a new field, I have a new spouse, I have a new 10-oxen plow, or I'm exhausted after work, or it interferes with the kids' activities, or God knows I need some me time. When I was writing this, I stared at the screen for a few minutes, wondering who would disobey if they'd gone to the effort of knowing God and loved Him, until I realized this describes anyone who had diligently worked at being God's child until life just got too busy and following God got choked out by the weeds. This is something that happens very gradually, and there's a good chance some of us here today are sliding slowly away from God. And so here's a special pre-invitation invitation. If that describes you, please let us know. Me, or Todd, or Danny, or one of the gals here, or anyone else here whom you can share your burden with. Please let someone know at the end of this lesson, or this afternoon, or on any other day of the week. Don't let yourself keep slipping away. That may be the easiest path now, but I can promise you, you won't like the outcome. How about knowing God? He's on a totally different wavelength than I am. We're too far apart for me to actually learn anything useful, aren't I? There's not anything I can really do about knowing God, is there? Paul, in Romans 10, verses 2 and 3, says, "For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God." If you don't know God the Father and make little effort to learn about Him, then you'll be lost when you try to obey. You'll have zeal and all the best intentions, like these new Christians in Rome that Paul was talking about, but you won't know what to do. Again, please don't let that happen. And that concludes the first part of this morning's lesson. In fact, in earlier versions of this outline, that was the icing on the cake. But I realized there were important things to talk about there as well. I begin by considering whether there were any overall lessons from the first half of our one another year that would be useful to discuss. As I reviewed my class notes from last quarter, I found a pattern, in fact, a familiar pattern. I've studied the interconnecting relationship of loving, knowing, and obeying and how all three call us to action in the service of God. This time, coming at it from the one another angle, I noticed that our responsibility to God of love, knowledge, and obedience match closely with our responsibility to one another of love, knowledge, and obedient service, which in turn reminded me of the first scripture we read today from Matthew 22, verses 34 through 39. Again, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The effort and care that we must put into knowing God, learning to love him, and diligently obeying his commands mirrors Christ's statement of the great and foremost commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the similar effort and care that we must put into knowing each other, learning to love each other, and giving humble service to each other mirrors that second command. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We've studied this topic before and have concluded that your neighbor is anyone you come in contact with, whether here at Northwest or at the far end of the globe. As it happens, we have several brothers who are about as far from us geographically as they can be, in the Philippines and Japan. We support them both financially and with encouraging notes, but most of us know little about them beyond their names. Practically speaking, we do what we can to hold up their arms, but it's this congregation where we'll have the best opportunities to learn about each other, not someone on the other side of the globe. These are the best opportunities here at Northwest to learn about each other, to know one another. Of all the one another commands, I singled out love one another for the title of this lesson, because it occurs over half a dozen times, and because love is at the core of the one another commands. Peter twice, in fact, says not just to love one another, but to love one another fervently. And in 1 Peter 1:22, he says, "Since you have, in obedience to the truth, purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart." We cannot fulfill these commands if we aren't spending time together. And that's not spending time just watching a movie. It's spending time interacting with each other and with God, worshiping together, studying together, just taking time to be together. In Hebrews 10, verses 24 and 25, it says, "Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Dwayne doesn't take attendance, and Danny doesn't preach sermons about the importance of attendance just because we want to check off as many attendance boxes as possible. Todd and I asked them to do these things because we can't do our job as shepherding the flock unless we can spend time with the flock. He and I can't encourage and build you up if you're not here to be encouraged, if you spend as little time as possible with the flock, if you are rarely available to get together with one another. And people who develop these habits of avoidance are too often the ones who wander away from the flock because they're not being encouraged, they're not being built up. Now, quickly in the same breath, I want to say that I have never worked with a congregation that is as eager to serve one another as the Northwest Church. That is, with any congregation, and especially with this topic, there are a lot of bases to cover. There are about 30 distinct one another instructions in the Bible, and I suspect everyone, and myself definitely included, could use some practice and encouragement in some of them. Just as you must work to know God, you must put effort into knowing one another. And just as you must earnestly love God, you must strive to love one another. And then you must seal the deal by giving helpful service to someone who needs it. I'll briefly add on to that this doesn't work unless you are willing to accept a loving gesture from someone else. So, let us work together, let us pray together, let's sing together and lift one another up as we strive to do God's will. Jason is about to lead us, and when he comes in glory, if we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.